Imagine holding a $100 trillion bill in your hands. Sounds like anyone's dream, doesn't it? Absolute wealth printed on paper. But what if I told you that this bill couldn't even buy 3 eggs? That it was so worthless that people threw it in the trash, used it as toilet paper, or burned it to keep warm in winter? This isn't a science fiction story. It actually happened. In the heart of Africa, at the beginning of the 21st century, an entire country watched its currency disintegrate so rapidly that prices doubled every 24 hours. People took to the streets with wheelbarrows full of money just to buy bread. Children played with stacks of bills as if they were ordinary paper. And the government? It kept printing money non-stop in a spiral that seemed endless. How did a prosperous nation, known as the breadbasket of Africa, reach this point of collapse? Who was responsible? And most importantly, what can this story teach us about economics, power, and the decisions that shape the fate of millions? Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover about Zimbabwe and its $100 trillion bills will completely change the way you understand money and inflation. To understand how Zimbabwe came to print $100 trillion bills, we need to go back in time. In the 1980s, shortly after its independence in 1980, the country was one of Africa's most promising economies. Fertile lands, abundant agriculture, thriving mining. Zimbabwe was literally called the breadbasket of Africa. It exported tobacco, corn, wheat, and fed neighboring nations. Robert Mugabe, the leader who led the country to independence after years of struggle against British colonialism, was initially seen as a hero. Educated, charismatic, with fiery speeches about social justice and wealth redistribution. In the beginning, there were investments in education and health. Hope filled the air. But behind the rhetoric, the gears of power were beginning to rust. In the late 1990s, Mugabe faced growing political pressure. The economy was slowing down, the population demanded results, and then came the decision that would change everything: radical land reform. In 2000, the government announced the confiscation of land from white farmers, many descendants of European settlers, to redistribute it to the black population. In theory, it seemed like historical justice. In practice, it was the beginning of chaos. The confiscated farms were not handed over to experienced farmers, but rather to political allies, high-ranking military officers, and regime supporters, many with no agricultural knowledge whatsoever. Production plummeted. The country that fed the region began importing food. The economy, which depended heavily on agriculture, collapsed. Exports dwindled. Unemployment exploded. And when the economy crumbles, desperate governments take desperate measures. Without cash on hand, without international confidence, without foreign investment, Mugabe's government found an apparently simple solution: print more money. If there's no money to pay civil servants, soldiers, and keep the state apparatus running, why not simply manufacture more bills? This is where the story of the most devastating hyperinflation of the 21st century begins. In the early years of the 2000s, prices began to rise, slowly at first, 50%, 100% per year. Something worrying, but still manageable. But as the government continued printing money to cover its deficits, the spiral accelerated. By 2006, inflation was already in the thousands of percent per year. By 2007, it exceeded millions. People woke up in the morning to find prices different from the night before. A loaf of bread that cost 10,000 Zimbabwe dollars in the morning cost 15,000 in the afternoon. Workers rushed to markets as soon as they received their salaries because they knew that the next day that money would be worth less. Supermarkets hired employees just to reprice items several times a day. ATMs limited withdrawals because the machines couldn't hold that many bills. People carried bags, backpacks, even wheelbarrows full of money. A simple transaction required hours of counting. Restaurants stopped putting prices on menus. They asked customers to ask the waiter because the price changed between ordering and the bill. And the government, it kept printing. $1,000 bills became obsolete. Then came 10,000, then 100,000, 1 million, 10 million. The escalation seemed endless. Inflation charts became vertical, impossible to read on a normal scale. Economists began using logarithmic scales, something reserved for astronomical phenomena, not for national economies. In 2008, Zimbabwe entered what economists call catastrophic hyperinflation. The official rate was impossible to calculate. Independent estimates reached 89.7 sectillion% per year, a number with 21 zeros. Prices doubled every 24 hours, sometimes every few hours. It was the second worst case of hyperinflation ever recorded in history, second only to post-World War II Hungary. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe became an industrial-scale printing machine. And it was in this apocalyptic context that it emerged, the 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note. 100 trillion, a number so absurd it seemed like a joke, but it wasn't. It was officially issued in January 2009. At the time of its issue, it was worth about $30. Days later, it bought nothing. The scenes were surreal. Beggars on the streets refused billion-dollar bills. It wasn't worth the effort to keep them. Children built castles with stacks of money. Artists used the bills in collages. Some literally burned money for cooking because it was cheaper than firewood. Money had completely lost its function. It was no longer a store of value. It wasn't a medium of exchange. It was just colored paper with absurd numbers. The human impact was devastating. The formal economy virtually ceased to exist. Salaries were paid, but they meant nothing. Teachers, doctors, engineers abandoned their professions. Those who could fled the country. It's estimated that 3 to 4 million Zimbabweans emigrated, about a quarter of the population. Those who remained returned to a barter economy, to trade. They exchanged products for products or used foreign currencies on the black market. Public health collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicine, equipment, ability to operate. Life expectancy plummeted. Hunger spread in a country that decades earlier had fed the region. Schools closed. The social fabric disintegrated. Violence increased. It was economic apocalypse in slow motion, broadcast live. And Mugabe? He remained in power, increasingly authoritarian, blaming Western saboteurs and imperialists for the disaster. Opponents were persecuted, imprisoned, tortured. The free press was stifled. Elections were rigged. The regime maintained itself through force, fear, and the distribution of favors to the military and political elite, who enriched themselves while the country bled. Finally, in April 2009, the government made a radical decision. It abandoned its own currency. Officially, it allowed the use of foreign currencies: US dollar, South African rand, euro. The Zimbabwean dollar ceased to exist. The $100 trillion bills became instant relics. Today, ironically, they're sold on auction sites to collectors for values between $5 and $20 US, more than they were ever worth during their circulation. The decision stabilized the economy immediately. Inflation fell to normal levels, but the damage was done. An entire generation lost their savings, their jobs, their dignity. The economic trauma marked the country deeply, and the lessons? They remain forever printed on those absurd $100 trillion bills. The story of Zimbabwe and its $100 trillion bills is not just an economic curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when governments lose all sense of limits, when power becomes more important than responsibility, when political decisions completely ignore the laws of economics. Hyperinflation doesn't come out of nowhere. It's always a consequence of choices, bad choices, made by people who believe they're above the consequences. In Zimbabwe's case, it began with poorly planned land reforms that destroyed production. It continued with a government that, instead of recognizing the error and correcting course, chose to print money to hide the problem. And it ended with the complete destruction of trust in the currency, the economy, and institutions. Money, at the end of the day, is based on trust. It's not the paper that has value, it's the collective belief that that paper will be accepted tomorrow, that it represents real work, real production, real wealth. When that trust is broken, when the government abuses the printing press, the result is always the same. The currency dies. And here's the scary part. This can happen anywhere. Zimbabwe is an extreme case, but history is full of examples. Germany in the 1920s, Hungary in the 1940s, Argentina repeatedly, Venezuela more recently. Every time a government decides it can create wealth simply by printing paper, the tragedy repeats itself. The details change, but the plot is always the same. Today, Zimbabwe still struggles to recover. It tried to reintroduce its own currency in 2019, but mistrust remains. The wounds haven't healed. And those $100 trillion bills? They've become symbols, not of wealth, but of warning. They're the economic equivalent of a skull and crossbones. Danger, don't repeat this mistake. For us in the 21st century, accustomed to central banks, complex monetary policies, and digital economies, the temptation is to think we're immune. That we're too sophisticated to fall into the same traps. But are we really? When governments accumulate unpayable debts, when central banks inject trillions into the economy, when money creation becomes increasingly abstract and disconnected from reality, have we really learned the lesson? Zimbabwe teaches us that there are no shortcuts, that real wealth comes from real production, real work, solid institutions, that printed money without backing is just an illusion, and that when the illusion breaks, the price is paid by the most vulnerable, always. So the next time you hold a bill, remember, that paper only has value because millions of people trust that it will, and that trust is fragile, precious, and absolutely essential. And now I ask you, have our governments learned from this lesson of history? Or are we repeating the same mistakes in slow motion with different packaging? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this video made you think, like and share it. And subscribe to Enriching World, because here we uncover the stories the world forgets, but that have everything to teach us. See you in the next video.